My name is Jack Seigenthaler.
And I'm Maggie Bruck.
And you are listening to the first ever podcast to come out of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford University.
And today we'll be talking about water management in Monterey, California. Jack and I have talked about this water management. It doesn't sound that exciting.
Right, but as we've learned over the past few months, it's a really interesting issue. If you're like me and like much of America, you've never really had to worry about water. Sure, you've tried to turn off the water while you brushed your teeth or thought, well, maybe I need to spend less time in the shower. But in my hometown, water management was never on the front page of the paper.
But Connecticut is not California.
No.
And in California, water is life. People think about it a lot because water is just harder to come by here.
And this concern has consequences for local communities all throughout the state. Communities like Monterey. So Monterey is a county, and it's a peninsula, and it's a city on the peninsula in the county. So what are we talking about when we say Monterey?
Monterey is actually pretty big, almost 3 times as large as Rhode Island, and it has a little more than 400,000 people.
But our focus today is on an area known as the Monterey Water District. That's what we're talking about primarily in this podcast, which is about a quarter of the size of the county by population, so about 100,000 people. And this area includes, famously, the Monterey Peninsula. The peninsula is known worldwide for its beauty. It juts right out into the Pacific Ocean.
But close as the ocean is, people who live on the peninsula can't just stroll down to the beach for their drinking water. So the question is, where do these folks get their water?
So most people in the United States get their water from a publicly owned utility. The government runs your water operation. About 90% of the country has a public water system.
But that just isn't the case in Monterey.
No, so in Monterey, water is delivered to your doorstep by a private company called California American Water.
CalAm for short.
And CalAm is a branch of American Water, which is this huge multinational corporation. They deliver water to more than 15 million people in Canada and the United States.
And the folks on the Monterey Peninsula are among these people.
The thing about water is it's not like any normal good or service. People need water literally to survive, so the government heavily regulates water, and it regulates the private companies which provide it.
Right, and this makes sense. Not only can the government ensure that people get enough water, but they can also make sure that the water resources aren't being abused. For example, CalAm can't just drain a whole lake just because they want to.
And where CalAm can and cannot get their water depends on their water rights.
A water right is formally defined as a legal entitlement that authorizes water to be diverted from one source and put to some use. This use has to be what they call beneficial.
So what he's saying is, if CalAm wanted to take some water off a river to deliver to their customers, they need the state to tell them that they can. And the state can tell them how much they're allowed to take.
And this gets us right to the heart of the issue in Monterey. Because as it so happens, there is a river from which CalAm takes water and delivers it to their customers. And this is where our story really starts. The Carmel River.
The Carmel River.
The Carmel is a lovely little river. It isn't very long, but in its course it has everything a river should have.
That was John Steinbeck on our show.
Really? That was him?
That was totally him. That was just not me.
Great audio. I didn't know he was still alive. What we're talking about is what makes this river, the Carmel, so important.
Right, okay, so like we said, CalAm has water rights to this river going back to the 1960s. So they can take a certain amount of water off the river and put it to what's called beneficial use, which means deliver it to their customers in Monterey.
And this water is measured in acre-feet per year.
Acre-feet per year.
Or AFA. Dave Stolt, the general manager of Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, we'll talk about him later, but just so you know, this guy knows a lot about water in Monterey.
So I don't know how your water math is, but an acre foot is like a football field covered in a foot of water.
And for decades now, Cal-Am has been legally allowed to take about 3,000 football fields of water a year, about 3,000 acre feet.
But then the year 1995 rolled around.
Right, so just to track back for a minute, starting in the late 80s, some environmental groups, some resident groups, they got together and they said, hey, Cal-Am is taking way too much water off of the Carmel River.
Legally, things started happening. People started noticing in the mid-1980s that the river dried up every year. There are times when we've got huge events going on. Car Week is one of them, where it's one of the largest car auction, car show weekends anywhere in the world. And you can actually see the river go down from overpumping. And then on Tuesday after the thing, the river starts coming down. Yeah. And there have been times where, like on a weekend, Cal-Am overpumped and dried up a quarter mile of the river, and you go down and there's threatened red-legged frogs and fish carcasses. And so people were getting really agitated.
So these groups, these environmentalists and residents, they took their beef to the State Water Board.
And this is the board in charge of regulating water rights, managing water resources in California. They started poking around and they determined that Cal-Am was taking 14,000 acre feet per year off the river to deliver to their customers.
That is 5 times what they had the right to take.
Right, exactly. So in 95, the state board says you have to bring down the amount of water you're taking from the Carmel back to the legal limit, back to 3,000 acre feet per year. You're depleting the river, you're killing trout, you're killing vegetation, and above all, you don't have the legal right to take the water you're taking.
But there has to be another source of water in Monterey, right? They can't just be taking all this water off the river.
And there's the rub, because the problem is Cal-Am doesn't have really other major sources of water. 70% of the water they're delivering to their customers in 1995, it's from the Carmel River. There's another basin to the north of the peninsula and a reservoir, but the point is there's nothing they've got to replace all the water coming off the Carmel River.
And the state knew this. They knew they had to give Cal-Am and Monterey some time to find another water supply. So this order from the state in 1995, it functions more as just a slap on the wrist.
But that doesn't mean that Cal-Am can just ignore it, because eventually the state is going to come back and say, hey, you really need to get off the Carmel River.
And it's important to recognize, if the state says Cal-Am can't take water off the Carmel River anymore, it's not just a punishment for Cal-Am, it's the residents that are ultimately getting screwed. So what happens after 1995?
Well, for the next 14 years, not much, right?
No. Cal-Am looks into a few projects, county government looks into a new project, but nothing is developed that could replace the Carmel.
So then came 2009.
It's 2009 and there's no new major water supply. The peninsula has succeeded with a couple small projects, but Cal-Am is still taking more than 10,000 acre feet per year off the Carmel River.
Again, 7,000 acre feet more than they're allowed to take.
So the state doubles down. In 2009, the state said, now we're serious. You need to be pumping water from the Carmel at the legal limit. They issued what's called a cease and desist order, or a CDO.
And it meant Cal-Am needed to reduce its pumping of water off the Carmel by 2016, and the state would levy huge fines.
So now the threat is real and it's crunch time. 2016 gives Cal-Am just 7 years to accomplish what they failed to do in the last 14. Find a new water supply.
Right, and again, this is a real threat for everybody in this community, not just Cal-Am. The cease and desist order in 2009 forced the community's hand.
Cal-Am got together with the county of Monterey and another community just north of the peninsula and came up with an idea for a desalination project.
A desalination plant takes salty water, either from the ocean or the ground. Sometimes there's brackish water, which is salty water under the ground, not necessarily just in the ocean. It takes the salt out, distills the water, and voila, you've got a supply of drinkable water. It's, of course, a little more complicated than that, but that's the gist.
And this new project, it was called the Regional Desalination Project, or Regional Desal Project, and it gave the community a lot of hope. It was a big deal. It brought together public and private elements to find a replacement for the water from the Carmel River. By 2012, there were some accusations of criminal corruption, there was a mistrust amongst these different parties, and the project just totally collapsed.
And that cease and desist order, we heard somebody in Monterey describe it as a sword of Damocles, and it still loomed large over the community's head. So a quick aside on water supply here. The problem of water supply is really the problem of water demand.
You need enough water to fit your needs.
And a district's needs are complex. You know, you need water for your sink, yeah, but also restaurants and hotels and yards, etc. So the big first step in thinking about your supply is to consider how much water you actually need, to think about demand.
Which means a huge question: how much supply you need is how much more you can conserve.
Right, because that drives down your demand if you're conserving more. So you've already heard from Dave Stolt. He runs the Water Management District in Monterey. They're a government agency, and they're the chiefs of conservation regulation in Monterey.
So after the cease and desist order, even as the regional desal project collapsed, the Water District, Dave Stolt's agency, worked day in and day out to push down demand.
We came up with more draconian conservation measures. And so we're, laws and ordinances 2 decades ahead of the rest of the state.
And while we were down in Monterey, we heard time and again that the community is on the cutting edge of conservation. The average daily water use per capita across the United States, about 230 gallons. On the Monterey Peninsula, it's 55 gallons, so nearly a fifth of the national average.
The efforts to conserve water are wide-ranging. Metering every building in the district, retrofitting appliances. In fact, if you sit down to eat at a restaurant in Monterey, the waiter won't offer you water. You have to ask for it.
But these changes can be hard to swallow. I mean, take some members of the business community. We talked to the head of the Monterey Peninsula Business Coalition, a guy named John Narigi. He also serves as the general manager of a hotel called the Monterey Plaza. I met with him in his hotel, and it's gorgeous. It's right on the water. Back terrace basically leans into the bay. So I met John in his bustling lobby, so excuse the noise.
There's nothing more, I can honestly say this, there's nothing more that our industry can conserve. There's really nothing we can do.
Basically, he's saying the hotel just cannot conserve any more water. They could, but he'd have to close down rooms. And that's not just a bad thing for Mr. Narigi. That could be a bad thing for the peninsula.
The number one industry on the peninsula side of the county? Tourism. The hospitality industry brought in $2.6 billion in Monterey County last year.
And if you read the city budget for Monterey, you'll find that more than a quarter of their revenue, it comes from what's called the transient occupancy tax, which is basically a tax on tourism, on quote-unquote transient occupants. And it's like this for all the cities down there. So John Narigi's basically saying, look, I've acted in good faith. We've conserved all we can. We've complied with regulations. But when a water crunch means we have to turn away customers, it's bad for my business, and it's really bad for local government.
But we can take away two things from this. First, water supply is tied down to water demand, and second, water demand is tough to pin down, and it can involve a lot of different local interests. So that is part one.
Next time we'll be talking about how Monterey is actually going to solve this big, complicated problem.
A big thank you to Bruce, Iris, and everybody at the Bill Lane Center for helping to make this possible.
And thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.